Well, welcome. I have two settings on my backdrop, white and black, but I'm into the evening now and it's gone dark. So we flipped it around and I'm sitting here now with my evening surround on. It's really great to be here. Stefan, Arthur, Kathy, everybody, welcome. We've got a lot to talk about today. And just building up to this, it's been great fun. And I'm really looking forward to this. Emre hasn't said too much, so I'm going to take it upon myself to introduce the group that's going to be talking today. So I'll start with my top left there, which is Stefan. So he's head of product innovation, executive manager, RHR International. How would I describe Stefan? Organizational scientist. So I could read your bio, or I could just say that you're so interesting to talk to, Stefan. He's the kind of person where you book a call with him and you're watching the clock in the bottom right and you're thinking, we have a half an hour call and 26 minutes has gone past already and we've only just got started. That's how I want to introduce Stefan. So you can tell us some of the great things you're doing as we move through this. Welcome.
Thank you so much. An absolute pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. And then down to my lower left, in no particular order here, we've got Arthur, who I believe is working out of Zimbabwe at the moment, a lawyer, an academic from Utrecht University, member of the United Nations Global Pulse Expert Group on Governance, Data and AI, a doctoral associate at the University of Cape Town, now based at the Utrecht University of Ethics Institute. And Arthur, it was absolutely wonderful to get to know you leading up to this. And you said you let me off my imposter syndrome as I called you up by flipping it back on me, but it was such a privilege to get to know you. Welcome.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard. Welcome, everybody.
And then if you really want imposter syndrome, go and talk to Kathy. Kathy's doing some incredible work. Not only is she at Fujitsu, who are, as we know, one of the leaders in super technologies, artificial intelligence, big player in quantum as well, and incredible partnerships. Think back to my days at Oracle and spent a lot of time with Fujitsu. Kathy's VP, Regional CTO of North and West Europe at Fujitsu, 25 years experience in technology, industry and academia. She's written with and for the UN. She's focused on all sorts of technologies, 5G, blockchain, IT, as well as AI. She's got this interest and track record in using research to influence policy, policy decisions across all sorts of governments, NGOs, and of course, I mentioned the UN. Kathy's the sort of person that you can say 7G to, and she doesn't flinch. It's like, how is that possible? That she can see so far ahead. So we've got this broad range. We've got what you might call the futurists that I've just been introducing. Arthur looking at geopolitics, a great perspective on the world, particularly Africa, which is so exciting for innovation right now. And then Stefan, the people side of it, occupational psychologist. It's a meeting of minds and me as well. So. So welcome. We're up to 88 people. We're going to run till 6 p.m. I'm hoping that we can pick up some Q&A and some questions as we go along. So I was reminded of the quote from William Gibson. I think this was about 17 years ago. He said, the economist William Gibson said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. When we think about 2030, is there a sense that everything's already here? Kathy, help me out on this one to start with. Is everything already here? We just haven't seen it yet. Or are we going through a decade of mass transformation and discoveries?
So I think it's a really interesting question, and Steve Gibson, one of my favorite quotes actually, and I think it talks about two different things. So firstly, I think what we're seeing in the current era of digital technologies is from 1960 up until about 2004. I'm very particular about 2004. We had digital technologies that were doing the same business processes, just faster, more cheaply, et cetera, et cetera. We're basically doing exactly the same business process that we've done for hundreds of years. From about 2004 onwards, what we see is a confluence of different technologies coming together, creating what I personally believe is a new form of digital economy. I believe we are currently moving into a completely new economic system. Great fun to be, watching that. The other thing that I think is really sort of subtly hidden in his quote is the fact that quite often, yes, the future really is here, and some people have great access to the technology, and other people don't. And I think that we've seen that really clearly with COVID, for example. So we've seen large parts of the UK with children unable to get their education because they don't have access to the digital technologies, whereas other people have had full and complete access, no problem at all, if that makes sense. Hope that answers your question.
It does. It gets the ball rolling as well. Arthur, let me try out another quote, just because Kathy's bolstered my confidence on talking about quotes. This one's a nice, easy one. The Brookings Institute: whoever leads in artificial intelligence in 2030 will rule the world until 2100. What an odd thing to say. Now, is that just hype? Is that just nonsense? Arthur, what's your view on the 50,000-foot view of what's going on right now with AI?
Yeah, I think, artificial intelligence really defines, the future. But I think AI on its own, I think might actually reach what is called, the winter, unless it is combined with other technologies, for example, data optimization technologies. We are seeing what's happening in Africa at the moment, like, biometric data and also digital identity, and other technologies like facial recognition technologies that are harvesting huge amounts of data. Because without high value data and big data, AI might stagnate. But I think what is also important when I'm talking of high value data is data that is related to, like, digital sequencing information and all that, because I foresee AI converging with biology and other fields like nanotechnology to impact the future. But yes, of course, I think we have seen China in the past decade with huge amounts of data, sort of like taking an edge to catch up with the US. Although I think the USA still leads in terms of global market valuation, computing power, but also other indices like East Branch, Silicon Valley, and on other criteria as well. But I think data is the future, and I foresee I think countries that are putting in place data infrastructure, making some quantum leaps within the next few years.
Arthur, thank you. Let's stay at this high view for just a moment. Stefan, great to see you on the call. When we think about the future, I mean, it's such a big topic. The first thing that comes to mind, whether it's AI or anything else, is the problems we can solve. Are we so fixated on those? And is that the nature of our conversation today? Because sometimes we can feel we're like a species without a plan. Does it ever feel like that for you, Stefan?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant place to turn the conversation, because oftentimes we get hung up on the particulars when it comes to artificial intelligence, specifically around questions around ethics. And I think, unfortunately or fortunately, the opportunity here, as with most human ingenuity, is to really think about how power is distributed through AI. And that ultimately is the framework through which we can look at problems. And what I mean by that, for example, is how can we be truly democratic with how we look at problems in a way that services people and humanity for its betterment? I think currently the infrastructure that we have in place is not, the power is siloed in few and in spaces where power has historically been there, and unfortunately, ultimately removed from the needs of many people. And so I think we do need to get our ducks in a row, so to speak, with understanding what is the promise of AI? What are the problems that we're looking to solve? And is it actually for the people? And can we make that process democratic?
Stefan, let me stay with you for just one more moment, but I'd love to hear the other panelists weigh in on this. If a 6-year-old came up to you and said, "What's wrong with the world?" How would you go about answering that in a way they could understand?
Well, the task here is to simplify the question, and I think we always revert back to covertly, if not overtly, a problem between people, which ultimately becomes a problem between groups and ideologies. And so the real thing that underpins that is, where can we agree? What is actually universal about our human experience for us to agree on, so that we can come together and think about what needs to happen. I think a child won't be so concerned or fixated as we are with, again, the particulars, but more so what are the foundational points through which we can be successful.
Thank you, Kathy. You wrote a report, digital cooperation report with the UN, and in there, one of the highlights was the idea around inclusive digital economy and society. But taking Stefan's lead there, Kathy, do we agree on anything at the moment?
That's a really great question, and I genuinely love the way that you expressed the issue there, Stefan. That it's where ideologies meet, that we end up with a lot of different sort of confluence of problems. Really, that's where the conflict emerges. And what you can see in the report is that there's obviously been a negotiation and discussion, and everyone had to. It was a big group of people, and we had to have a lot of discussions around what is what is truly ethical. And one of the big issues, I think, and I'm an engineer, I'm not a philosopher or anything useful in the world, shall we say, but one thing that struck me is that the ethics of one person is not the same as the ethics of another. So when we're talking about AI ethics, what are we really talking about? Mm-hmm. Whose ethics are we genuinely talking about? And I feel that there could be ethics embedded into our technology subconsciously that we haven't even thought about. Like just the fact that a lot of our platforms consume incredible amounts of data. That was an ethical decision at some point in time that someone's taken effectively on the behalf of everyone in the world. So yeah, does that help, Richard? But I think effectively what we have to do, and it is find new ways to come to a common conclusion as human beings across the world around what these technologies truly mean and the impact that they genuinely have. The corollary is the nuclear era, where we had to negotiate nuclear treaties with one another. Is it the same sort of thing that we need to do because of the potential risk that these technologies can also have on the world?
Kathy, thank you. Arthur, let me bring you back into the conversation. We're looking at the road to 2030 and beyond, of course, encompassing maybe 19 or so years in this conversation. Exponential change, rapid pace, evolution of us and technology obviously means that this is a wide-ranging discussion. There seems like there's two fundamental things that massive amounts of data, connectivity, machine learning and deep learning can do that we've never really had before. And that's to massively change our external world. So if we just think about plastic for a second, we can use satellite technologies and machine learning, and we can get plastic back out of the ocean, right? I mean, we can start to undo some of the damage we've done. Or we can use AI on us. We can apply AI to nudging and changing us, changing our mind, changing our mindset, which is the biggest opportunity to create a fairer, more equitable world that we might be starting to describe in this conversation, Arthur.
Sorry, come again, the last question.
It was a long one. Sorry.
Richard?
Should we change our environment or change our minds?
The last part.
Change our environment or change our minds, Arthur, with AI? What's more useful?
I think what we need to do is sort of like, I think, shifting our paradigm, because I think the race for AI is being fueled by, I think, partly nationalism, but also I think the philosophy of, like, rationality. to say, no, we want to create very intelligent machines, but without looking at societal implications. Like, for example, here in Africa, I think one of the most important things is how we relate, how we, care for each other. Those are important attributes and important values. So I think if we change, the whole approach, where it is about, creating, machines that outcompete human beings, or maybe the race between nations, and try to think about other moral considerations and other ethical considerations about, I think, like, if I were to take an example, automation, for example, like, companies, that believe in automation. But I think here in Africa, if you automate agriculture, or if you automate, certain services or certain aspects of life that are supposed to be done by human beings, life tends to lose meaning. So I think what we need to do is change, the mindset, say that I think in terms, even if rationality is important, like creating, super intelligent machines, but it's also important to take into account, cultural variations, people's histories and aspirations, to create machines, that can cooperate instead of, competing with human beings.
Arthur, thank you. Yes, wise words. We're getting some Q&A come through that I'm going to incorporate into this discussion. Stefan, I'm going to loop back because I want you to have somewhat of the last word on this next discussion. And the question really is actually about AI. What sort of advances do we think we're going to see in this decade? So I'm going to ask Kathy to lead on that. Just to set the scene here, we think about GPT-3 that's been released, trained on 175 billion data points, up from, I think, 10 billion was the record before that. But we still need these huge data sets. Does AI lack reasoning and logic? So I want to explore that journey to what we would call powerful AI at the end of this decade. And then, Stefan, I'll come to you, because then the natural next point on that is about the relationship between us and machines, and human in the loop and responsibility. So are you okay for me to pick that conversation with you up in a minute?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Kathy, I bought you a few seconds of time there to launch us off.
Completely forget the question, Richard. No. So it's always notoriously difficult to predict the future, right? So what do we think is actually going to happen with AI? Personally, short-term view, I think we're going to start seeing AI on what we call the edge, which means that we would start to see the opportunity to decentralize a lot of the AI sort of processing, and have data which is retained in place, in situ. So the data, instead of being pushed into a massive, large sort of, data lake, whatever you want to call it, would stay where it is and be processed where it is. And, it would allow, firstly, more control over data. So if it's your personal data, you would be able to control it and control who accesses it, rather than having to have it centralized with someone else maintaining it. But I think over the next sort of longer term period, I think the issue that we see in the short term, of course, is that AI is not really intelligent. Let's be brutally honest, it's actually a blunt instrument right now. And training, 175 billion data points, is that really equivalent to a human brain's capacity? No, it's not. We know it isn't. But we know over time it probably will start to get to that point, right? And so I think, we're going to start to see a lot more philosophical discussions around AI and what it actually means. And for me, I think I relate the AI discussion, potentially, this is a slightly different way to answer your question, Richard, to the exact period of time when we got the Victorian era, when the Victorians started to actually have a massively profound impact on the physical structure with civil engineering, right? We're at that period of time now, I think, with data science and AI and all of these kind of technologies. That's when the civil engineers realized, hang on, this is starting to have a profound impact on the world, and we have to create ethical frameworks. To be a civil engineer, there's a whole bunch of extra training you do on top of your degree. And I think we're going to start to see some of those demands placed onto the AI communities, onto computer scientists, and onto the engineers who, build these kind of solutions and systems. And I really like, Gary, your question here, or your statement. So, why do we always actually fixate so much on AI? And you're quite right that a lot of these other type of technologies you've mentioned here, batteries, quantum nanotechnology, but also bioengineering, I think is going to have a pretty profound impact in the future. And as Arthur mentioned, it's when you bring those technologies together that we're going to start to see that rapid change. I think, personally, I'd be really interested to see what happens with bioengineering together with AI. Then we become the machine, right? Rather than talking about the difference between the human and the machine. I don't know if that was exactly what you were asking me to talk about, Richard, but I hope it was a little bit of a thought starter as we.
Kathy, now stay with me for just one more second.
Sorry.
You mentioned Victorians, and we got pretty busy in the UK in that time building the Industrial Revolution. But did you know that the railways cost about 2 to 3 times our GDP? So getting that revolution started cost 2 to 3 times our gross domestic product. Yet here we are investing fractions of our GDP in AI, in data, in climate. So have we missed the point that they got all that time ago, that this is bigger than it looks?
I absolutely do think we, in particular, I do feel like we're a little island hanging off the ridge, not just the edge of Europe, but the edge of the world. Briefly, sorry to all the British people.
That's a separate point, to be honest, but yes. It was more a general point about investment rather than just how badly we're doing right now in the UK, Kathy.
Sorry, guys. But I think that, I think Arthur brought up this point, really, really well at the beginning. The people who are, the countries who are investing huge amounts of money are really going to be able to take over and dominate, like the Brookings Institute said, right, up until 2100. And I think that is absolutely right. That's where you see China investing huge amounts of money, right? And I think what we see is a big difference in, if we compare from the Victorian era to today's era, there's actually a significant more amount of private money involved in that investment as well, right? So the United States has been, all of those large companies have been driven by private investment, and therefore they're seeking a massive return on the capital. And I think that's a little bit of something that we're missing in Europe. We have failed to invest enough to be able to continue to compete. That is my personal opinion. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy. We certainly don't have a large tech company in Europe like you would have in China and the US. But let's bring more of our panelists back in. Arthur, I'd love to hear your angle on that. But if you want me to just put something in the mix here for you as well, my friend John Kamara from Kenya talks about the need for camels more than unicorns in Africa, stability, resilient companies that can withstand rather than just a few that shoot up to the stars. So AI camels, is that something we want to see more of everywhere, or particularly in Africa?
Yeah, I think Africa at the moment, I think what I'm trying to drive at is probably, I think I could answer your question in a different way, because socially beneficial AI has to be broad-based, I think more inclusive, particularly I think because Africa has got many sub-populations. You go to a country like Rwanda, for example, they could be probably, I think, 15 to 20 languages. Kenya, maybe 40 languages. Zimbabwe, 10 languages. South Africa, I think the same. Ethiopia is even worse, and Nigeria. So probably I think what we need to do in Africa is to invest in AI that encompasses all those subpopulations. Like, let's take, for example, natural language processing. Most of the languages that are driving AI are European languages like English, French, and a few other languages. But Africa is being left behind, not only as a continent, but there are some subpopulations. You go to South Africa, probably I think that most of the data sets that you find being for training applications could be, I think, Zulu, for example, or you go to Kenya, probably I think the language that is associated with the ruling party is the one that is being reflected in the natural language processing models. So I think what we need in Africa is not to rely on data farms or to rely on highly intelligent machines, but because we were left out in the first, second, and third industrial revolution. So if we invest in high-tech technology, that is only likely to benefit the elite. So what we need is cheap technology. Like I think India is taking a lead on that. Like when you go to India, they've got very cheap cars. You can buy probably a car, a couple of £100. You can buy a car. I think that's sort of AI that we need in Africa, where we rely on sustainable approaches. For example, when you go to Google Ghana, for example, they are experimenting with compressed forms of algorithms and less data. You go to Kenya, there are projects like Samasos, where they are using local populations, to label and to collect and label, data sets. So these are very small scale AI projects, to me, which are more inclusive, that are sustainable in the long run. So the models that we need, like when you look at Bolisian, which is a Dutch company, you look at Element AI in Canada, you look at IDRC or Omdina, for example. Omdina, they are doing great job in sort of like, promoting AI that sort of like, represent all Africa's subpopulations, instead of just, focusing on sort of like, white elephant AI that is likely to benefit, the elite. And maybe finally, there is AI that is being developed outside. When it comes to Africa, sometimes it doesn't really fit the African context. For example, like the facial recognition technologies that are AI empowered, from China, they are being used. Those technologies are being used in unequal and undemocratic environments. Biometric technology, digital identities, because all those technologies are related to AI, but they are not really useful for improving public services. They are now being used by politicians to further their political agendas. So what we need is, applications that are developed by Africans or that are developed with consultations of Africans to see, in order for those applications to have sustainable and broad-based broad-based impact to Africa's various subpopulations. I'm not really sure whether I answered the question. I sort of like blabbed through.
Arthur, thank you. Let's frame this as an open discussion rather than whether or not you're exactly answering my questions. We have an expansive topic. Stefan, let's bring you back very squarely into this conversation. There's Q&A coming through. What are the greatest barriers to AI developments? Geopolitical, technical, human. What does it mean to be human in AI? I'd love to touch on those with you. Reference them now if you want, but also later in this conversation. But Arthur brought up Omdina. And Omdina is really asking the question, how do we get more open innovation? How do we get more outside-in innovation? They'll run competitions. They've got something like 1,200 global data scientists that contribute to projects. They expand horizons. These are all the things that AI needs to succeed. This is all the human side of it, the human awareness side of it. Stefan, what are you seeing around the trends in that?
Yeah, so first, I love both the points that Kathy and Arthur raised, specifically around AI being a tool and AI needing to be inherently inclusive for it to be useful. I want to take a step further in that and say that we're in an interesting time in discovering and redefining what humanness entails. And what I mean by that is, if you were to put characteristics of chairs in a unstructured model, for example, it'd be quite easy to come out with clear criterion that is consistent with chairness across the board. Now, if you were to do the same sort of experimental exercise with humans. It's much more messy. And more meaningfully, the messiness, the error in the algorithm is actually the quality, the nuance of human experience. And what I think that AI often, the conversation around AI often misses is that although we can account for much of the variance through these algorithms, it's the error through which we draw insight and meaning. And that's the humanness that we're not finding systematic ways of approaching. And because of that, we're leading ourselves into conflict, because within that, there are differences between how people prioritize and form a genealogy of values. And unfortunately, if the AI cannot inclusively look at all people and weigh those variables equally in a meaningful way, then someone inherently gets left behind, a group inherently gets left behind. And so I think it's important for us to think about what are we actually optimizing for, and are we accommodating the margins and the deviance in a way that is beneficial to human beings. I think, and going back to why I began by saying Kathy and Arthur's points are so useful here, is because AI should be a tool to enhance inclusion. I think if we were to distill down cultures and societies across time, that it's fair to say, and data would suggest this as well, it's fair to say that humans are inherently social beings. We're inherently social species. And so if we're not enhancing or improving our ability to socialize with other people, then it becomes an issue of utility divorced from humanity again. And the problem with that is obvious, but more profound than that is because the distance that creates builds upon itself. So I'll give you an example of this. If we were to think about this recent US election is a good example. If you were to look at big data, you would see that richer states vote Democratic, but richer people vote decidedly Republican. So if you're unable to tease out the nuances objectively in that data, you're not sure how to optimize your algorithms for benefit or for utility for meeting human needs. And so I think, again, the problem is us getting back to the basics. I know I'm reverting back to essentialism and all this, but getting back to the basics of what it is that is human that we're looking to enhance, evolve, and to benefit from through AI, instead of just pure objective utility.
Do you have any views on what that road to more inclusivity looks like, Stefan? If AI is used as any other corporate tool, I mean, take corporation tax. What does every company do? They just try and stay just the right side of the line so it's legal and maximize profits. Do we? I see Alexa flashing. Let me turn that off. Too late. And so the question there is that, you know, what's the chicken and the egg here, the cart and the horse? That if we keep that mindset that we've probably had since about 1973, how do we add more shareholder value? Then AI has its place in that, and we know what it's going to do. It's going to turn the screw harder. So what has to shift first? What has to move first? And do we need triggers? Do we need triggers like COVID, triggers like climate, to get that great shift to move so that we would use AI more inclusively rather than just a tool for more shareholder value?
Yeah, it's a brilliant point. And I think I'd break apart this into two work streams. One would be more psychological and philosophical, and I'll highlight my bias here. But in us using behavioral sciences and using studies in humanities to understand what, again, is essentially beneficial to humans, and that is, again, hard to read just through big data. That's first, like going back and hitting the drawing board and understanding what it is that we need. The second is more of infrastructure. So do we have policies set in place that can effectively and sustainably regulate our data gathering, analyzing, and drawing insight processes in a way that is inherently inclusive? And that is a process that needs to be involved, deliberate, and democratized, basically. Because again, if a certain segment of people with protected interests are establishing the criterion of what good looks like, then it will, by default, alienate those who don't fit into that criteria.
Thank you, Stefan. I remember the hand dryer that couldn't recognize black hands. But it starts with so many questions about why you even need a hand dryer to recognize hands in the first place. I mean, what is the use case that they're trying to solve before we even get to the mad biases that make it such a bad idea at that stage? Thank you so much for those insights. Kathy, let's try and pick up a couple of questions as I bring you back into this conversation. So Ali says, is AI actually what we need? So that's one point. And then Josimar says, what about all this unemployment? And Gary says, but is AI ever really going to understand me? And we've already touched on this AI winter idea. So the question, Kathy, is, could AI become quite distasteful this decade? We think about GMO, nuclear power, conversations about vaccines, a sort of uncertainty and unease about AI because of the way that we're going about using it.
Well, I'll respond to your question with another question. Hasn't it already? I think when we're actually looking at a situation, right, where Facebook, has been accused of, let's say, manipulating elections. It's been, the US, the Brexit vote. It's been accused of these kind of things already. What I would say is that there is actually an emerging sort of fundamental mistrust for a lot of these technologies in many spaces, and with sort of a valid reason. And so, when I sort of think about what does that, what does it really mean? If we think about, the normal circles of sustainable development, environment, economy, society, you're supposed to think about all three things before you develop a solution. For me, in the middle is where trust in technology would lie, because if you forget society, people won't trust it. If you forget the environment, people will end up not trusting it. Or if you ignore the economy, people end up not using it because it's not viable, right? And so the sweet spot is the bit in the middle. And I think that is where we need to sort of think about aiming AI. And I really like, Stefan's comments. We, instead of framing it as how can we create the most utility out of this tool, AI should be used to enhance inclusion. It should be used to improve the environment. It should be used to improve the economy for people, touching on the question around jobs, right? So, and I think for me, AI really is challenging a lot of our pre-existing social norms. So we've had a social contract around work for probably a couple of hundred years. Really, right? We've had an established sort of understanding of a social contract around trust. What does it mean to be a citizen in a country where, potentially my government suddenly is largely driven by AI? Is that something, if we think about government processes being increasingly turned into AI, what does that actually imply to be a citizen? Right, in that nation state. So I think there's a lot of different sort of questions that we can sort of think about and think through here.
Thank you, Kathy. You mentioned jobs and the economy, and creating more jobs is a great way to grow the economy. I'm always conscious of population growth when I see people talking about new jobs, and I think, well, yes, and with another billion people, you're going to need another billion jobs at least in that number. Arthur, I've never understood this phrase, AI creates jobs. AI creates efficiencies, AI creates productivity potentially. Where did this idea come from? Is it just me that doesn't understand how AI creates a job?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, but I think if I'm answering from an African perspective, yes, I think I was in South Africa, the other time, and they've got Uber now in South Africa. They've got Airbnb and all that. So when they are saying AI creates jobs, I think it's about a European who comes with an American, and then he tells all the taxi drivers, to say, well, you're going to leave all your jobs, and then I'm going to employ you. Every one of you who has a car, if you own a car, you potentially have a job. So the sort of jobs, they are talking about are putting Africans or people from the global South on the lowest rung of the ladder in terms of, for example, if you're gonna be using your car, as a taxi, we can't call that a job, really. I think it's just creating a gig economy, is it? So in other words, I think maybe as Africans, we are getting maybe the crumbs. And then all that money is siphoned back, say, to Silicon Valley. I think if we are talking of the platform-based businesses as well, like I think the food industry is being Uberized. You go into farming, there's automation. So where are all those profits going? The profits are going back to those who own the technology, who own the app. So the sort of jobs that we are talking about that AI is creating are low-value jobs that are not putting much money in the pockets of Africans, and that is not putting income tax back into the pockets of the government. So yeah, creates jobs, but what sort of jobs are we talking about? Low-quality jobs that are not really adding any economic value or any revenue to African countries.
Arthur, just
middle income countries, for example, maybe India and Latin American countries as well.
Arthur, I apologize for interrupting there. I thought you'd paused because of the VoIP connection. There's been a little bit of pushback around the way that we're talking about Africa, which is really interesting to see. Always welcome feedback that we can utilize and use. What sort of initiatives are really exciting you right now across the continent? What's different? What's innovative? What can we really get on and see in the next decade coming out of Africa?
In Africa, exciting things are happening in Kenya, for example. I think when you go, say, maybe Ghana, for example, the young developers, they are encouraging the youth, the young people, including girls, not only into STEM education, science and technology, but also into AI development. I was talking to Google engineers in Ghana the other time. They actually have some sort of policy to encourage young people to, using TensorFlow in agricultural applications, like, crop disease diagnosis. And then you go to Uganda, for example. Uganda has interesting initiatives, particularly when it comes, to climate change. Makerere University, for example, there's quite interesting work, that is happening in terms of air quality prediction, climate change. And then South Africa, that's another, good, interesting hotspot where quite a number of initiatives, I think, particularly encouraging women. That's another good example. Then Kenya again. But in terms of initiatives, I think I'm fascinated by what Mashakane is doing, like, natural language processing, trying to create, data sets for African languages to make sure that Africa is not left behind in future. So that I think AI is not just driven by European languages, but we also have African data sets. But if you go to Ethiopia, Ethiopia is another interesting country, like, ICOG Labs. They are doing very interesting initiatives like, Robert Sophia, they contributed to that. But also, I think the other projects that are interesting in Africa are like, geospatial data, projects, ensuring that we have enough, big data to train, some of these applications. But I think on a sad note, most of our governments in Africa are not like AI ready. Like when you look at the Oxford Insight Index, the 2020 that came out about 2 months ago, the governments are not ready. So the agenda for AI is actually mostly being pushed by international development agencies like the IDRC Canada, for example. I mentioned Omdina, I mentioned Bolivian. But yeah, Rwanda is doing amazing stuff. Rwanda is doing amazing stuff in terms of data optimization technologies like Inca Mondru, where they are putting data together that can drive these applications in future. I think we go to Kenya as well. Kenya, I'm sure the what is it called again, where they pulled data from different sources. So Kenya is doing very interesting stuff in terms of crowdsourcing data. That's a very good model that is being replicated across the world. But I think on a sad note is the data that is actually being collected through biometrics, through digital identity. You go to Kenya, for example, they've got an interesting digital identity scheme. That when you look at a report that came out 2 months ago, that was done by a foundation in Germany, that particular data is now being used for political reasons, which means that I think the politicians, when they are going towards elections, they can analyze that population data to sow seeds of division among the populations in order for them to win election. So that is sort of like a downside that is happening in Africa. But on a positive note, there's quite a lot of stuff happening in Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa.
Thank you. Thank you so
much.
much.
Nigeria too, yeah.
Thank you for that. We've got about 7 minutes before I need to hand back to Emma. So we're now at that point where time starts to speed up that we always get to. Stefan, you've been quiet for a little bit. I'm keen to bring you back into this because we touched on jobs. And if we're going to talk about one vision of the future, it's this wonderful idea that a 5-year-old could want to be a violinist and actually be a violinist and not have to be an accountant or an admin exec because we'll all be freed up and we won't need to work the same jobs anymore. Is that realistic or is that still a pipe dream?
Well, I wouldn't say it'd be hard to determine either or now, but the more useful thing to say is that there's a lot of work for us to do to make it less of a pipe dream. And I think it again goes to the consistent undercurrent of what we've been speaking about in this conversation and really staying attuned and tapping into AI being there to complement and act as a periphery to human initiatives and engagements and not as a means to replace them. And I think right now, because this whole space is deeply influenced by the commercial and economic underpinnings, we are simply just moving towards that which is viable and sells instead of that which is going to push forward our species. And I think if we were to sit in our own deep self-reflection and introspection, we'd realize that although work is fulfilling and rewarding, creative work and self-expression and a sense of agency and determination trumps all things. It's because we've been gifted with this interesting thing unique to our species, so we think, called consciousness. And consciousness sort of pervades how we find ourselves in the world. And that goes back to playing the violin. You know, that playing the violin is a creative exercise. It's this deeply self-fulfilling, this deeply self-actualizing exercise, just like engaging in other creative pursuits. And I think if we were to distill down what really brings forth flourishing and fulfillment, that it comes along those parameters. But again, the commercial story tells something different. And so I think it won't have to be a pipe dream if we get very on top of where we're at right now currently, given that AI still has a fair ways to go before mass adoption and deep sophistication. But we do need to think about our philosophical and psychological narratives, as well as the policies, practices, and tools set in place. And regulatory bodies need to be established and scaled en masse for us to be able to do that effectively.
I love it. Thank you, Stefan. I love it. Did you notice that I'd managed to dodge the word consciousness for 52 minutes of this conversation so that we don't talk about conscious machines? But you said it at this point, so I think we can get away with it. Kathy, we got 3 minutes. I'd love you to take us home. We've had a big topic today. Let's finish with a big question. What is the best possible outcome for the relationship between humans and intelligent machines? Where do we start on that?
Wow. Okay. Thanks for that, Richard. Okay. So, firstly, I'd like to before we do close, I'd love to say, but please tell me you have a podcast, Stefan. I think I would love to hear many more of your thoughts. So please, if you don't have one, please make one. I think you know what. How long is a piece of string, really, Richard? So, you know, how do we get there? I think it's one where we as a society have thought through, what does it mean to be human by people much smarter than me? And what do these technologies actually really do? And what are they actually capable of? Really effectively, what you're doing with digital technologies is doing this with a flip-flop switch. That's a very simplistic way. You're basically playing with ones and zeros. And I think it's really important to not conflate digital technologies with intelligence. I think almost AI is a really bad name for what we're trying to do with this stuff. And I think it's one where we have understood that if we're going to have this massive impact on our entire society, our economy and environment, we have included many more people than ourselves, just you know, these so-called people who are computer scientists in that discussion, and we have enabled a discussion that's across all of society. So we get input and insight into what it genuinely means and what it should be to advance our species. I love that. I love that expression there. So how do we advance our species with this? That is a broad discussion that needs to be forged across society. So for me, it's really about taking the concepts that we have that seem to be very much stuck within the ivory towers at the moment or in large corporates, and actually making them accessible and usable for the average everyday user. When we did that with the mobile phone, incredible things happened. When we gave computational capacity into the hands of the average everyday people, not just focused within the corporate world, we got Bitcoin. And that, I think, is, you know, that is really, because that was the expression of what human beings really wanted to do with that technology. They wanted to break down the established regime of the banking system. So I think we will see a lot more once we put AI. And actually, the wonderful thing about the iPhone, was it 12? That chipset has AI. So now we're going to have AI on people's devices. I think we're going to see some crazy, crazy good things. We're going to see what people really want to do with it and really what can be achieved, hopefully, for the advancement of our species. Not all of it will be, but hopefully most of it will be.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much. I'm just realizing we've got 55 minutes and we didn't talk about Elon Musk either. We've done very well, and I think we're better off for that. Einstein said the world will not evolve past its current state of crisis by using the same thinking that created the situation. And I hope today that we haven't had that same thinking that caused these crises, and them different thinking, different solutions. Stefan, Arthur, Kathy, thank you so very much for joining me. Emre, thank you for making this possible.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for this closing panel. And we just wanted to say a few thank yous just to close the conference. First and foremost, thank you to all of the presenters We've had over 50 hosts and presenters today from over 20 institutions. We've also had over 1,000 delegates, which is just super. The conference has been 50% of the participants have been from not just outside the UK, but outside of Europe, which is just amazing. We've made sure that the conference was free, and we're hoping to keep whatever we do free and accessible to everyone, anyone who's interested. We've seen a huge spectrum of presentations and discussions, from foundational AI presentation. We had an amazing talk by Enzo from Cisco. We've had, this session just ended up, I'm proud, I feel like we've curated it in a way that ended up having, it felt like we were in a philosophy department. So we've just had an amazing time. It's been an amazing day as well. We just want to say thanks to everyone. Please reach out. Just finally, thanks to UCL AI Center, thanks to UCL's Innovation Enterprise, thanks also to Cisco and everyone else who's participated in this and made this possible. Please reach out. Sorry, we had some technical glitches, so you received way too much emails. We apologize for that. We'll have that stuff sorted next time. But thank you, everyone, and goodbye. And please do feel free to reach out. Thanks, Kathy. See you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.